we'll get going. There'll be some other folks who I think who will be joining us. This is the CSIS Careers and Development Series. And with me today is Rick Ehrenreich. That's him, the bald guy. And Jennifer Mills next to him. And they're both with INAR, the State Department, which is the Intelligence and Research Bureau within the State Department. That's sort of the brains of the State Department. They do the research and analysis and all those sorts of things. And it's an interesting part of state, and that people don't hear about a whole lot. Rick has spent most of his career, almost all your career, in INR, and Jennifer's her starting career in INR. And so they're going to talk a little bit about foreign affairs and how it relates to AID, and then a little bit about the Foreign Service and civil service and careers in the foreign affairs area. So with that, Rick, turn it over to you.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Bill. It's kind of an interesting question because we work at INR, Bureau of Intelligence and Research, the State Department, and you're sort of thinking, so where does this come in with careers and development? And I thought about it a little bit, and it sort of does, partly because how I first got to know Bill Garbling was back a very long time ago, probably, yeah, a couple of years ago, 2-3 years ago during the Bush 1 administration, I think. And it was a very, very interesting time for international relations, for development and such. And what we had at that time was kind of a big shift, both in the way USAID was operating, in the way the world was operating. And what we saw was sort of the end of the Cold War, and also sort of a new way of dealing with disasters. Truth be told, Bill was never much of a development kind of guy, even though he spent his career with USAID, but he was a disaster guy with Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, part of AID. And one of the things that was going on during that period was they had done a pretty good job of sort of figuring out when there's going to be a famine because of various mechanisms like the famine early warning system that was put in place around that time. They could sort of anticipate natural disasters coming. But one of the things that couldn't be anticipated or could not be anticipated with the tools that USAID had at the time were things like political disasters. In the 80s, you'd have a political disaster in a place like Ethiopia, which would lead to the Ethiopian famine. But at the time, Ethiopia was a Stalinist state, completely closed off to most of the rest of the world, and our ability to affect or prevent that famine was limited. Just a couple of years later, a few years later, as the Cold War wound down, a lot of places opened up. But there was still the problem of disasters stemming from political, military situations that were not in the area of expertise of most of USAID, certainly at that time. And that's sort of where we came in the sense that we were part of Bureau of Intelligence and Research at State Department, and just kind of informally we interacted with USAID. And part of it was just the fact that aid and state were in the same building, or most of aid and most of state were in that same big building down where the State Department is now. And it was a very, very good way to have sort of cross-fertilization of talents. Particularly, I work on African affairs, we work on African affairs. And, you'd walk down the hall, and in a sense it was kind of a different time because most people's doors were open. Our doors these days are pretty much locked in INR, and you guys have probably mostly been to the Ronald Reagan building where everything is closed and locked and you have these very sterile corridors. State at that time was a much more open place. A lot of doors were open. People would interact, stick their heads in the door, have coffee. We'd invite you guys to our meetings. They'd invite us to their meetings. We'd all have sort of an informal way of knowing what's going on and sharing it with each other. And it was particularly, we had a pretty close relationship, I think in the early, mid-'90s until USAID left the building in about '97. And I think that what we have done since, again, Africa's relations with aid are just not what they were back then because the informality of it is gone. But we still get together with USAID people from time to time. Usually go down to their offices, but it's a lot more constrained and constricted. The sort of like informal cross-fertilization that went on considerably isn't there. They have this story about this building on the MIT campus called Building 20, where multiple Nobel Prizes were won or inventions were made. The first serious hacking was done there. It was this huge building, big sprawling wooden thing where everybody interacted and a lot of creative thought came out of it. Now, I do not want to put the State Department in that category at all, but there was a lot more sharing when USAID was there. One of the things that has happened in more recent years, INR, particularly a section of INR called the Office of Geography and, the Office of Geography and Global Issues, sort of reached out with more of a formal attempt to interact with USAID and NGOs. And they have gradually established, but it's been running pretty well for several years now, what they call the Humanitarian Information Unit. And that includes some folks from state, folks from aid, folks from NGA, which is the National Geospatial Agency, which does the satellite photography and such like that. And the idea is to have like a clearinghouse of information that aid and NGOs would be able to access fairly easily. It's a little more formal, but I think it generally works fairly well. And there's some old OFDA alumni that are still working there, and I think our office, the Office of Analysis for Africa, is mainly, we focus on Africa. And we focus on Africa in all of its permutations, economic, political, military, social, whatever comes up, whatever seems interesting and relevant at the time, we'll deal with it. That made it from time to time, we interacted a lot with aid. We do so a little less now. We deal with the Office of Population, Refugees, and Migration, part of state, which is, again, not development, more disaster relief, but, and some of the other offices, but we are very geographically focused. I came there to INR many years ago, and I could probably tell my stories about getting a job there. Some of it might be relevant, but I think Jenny Mills, who just started a couple of months ago, her experience in getting a job in INR is a lot more relevant than mine. And even where mine is relevant, if I sort of say back when I was looking at it, it would certainly sound irrelevant. So if Jenny wants to go and talk about her end of things, thanks.
Thanks, Rick. So I graduated from the Joan B. Kroc School of Peace Studies in 2010, and the philosophy of the school was to take development, conflict resolution, human rights, and human security and bring them together. Instead of looking at them in silos, see the overlapping nature of them. And so when I graduated, I automatically went out into the NGO world thinking that this was the right place for me, that maybe I would be able to look at all of these different topics and actually bring them together. So I went out into the NGO world, worked for a number of human rights organizations, peace-building organizations, but still realized that they were operating very much in these silos. And so I was speaking with a number of my mentors, and several of them said, well, have you ever thought about working for the US government? Which I responded, no. I've always been a non-governmental person. So someone mentioned the Presidential Management Fellowship Program, which is one of 3 pathways programs that's offered for the executive branch under the Office of Personnel Management. And someone mentioned that it was this great leadership program that at the end of a 2-year fellowship, you're offered a job. And so I applied. I think the application was due 2 weeks later, and I hopped on board and went through a rigorous process of lots of tests and putting myself out there, networking. I moved to DC on multiple occasions just to network, and finally landed a position at Department of State at the Bureau for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. I spent 2 years off and on in DRL. Part of the PMF program is you get to do 2 development assignments, and this is one of the most unique parts of this program, is they are wanting to build the next generation of leaders in our government, and they want individuals to be able to taste the very different tools, mechanisms, interests, equities of multiple different either agencies within the executive branch or even within your own agency. So for me, I did a rotation out to Embassy Bangui in Central African Republic, a nice little war zone, and had a very unique opportunity to be the only Pole Econ officer out there with an embassy of maybe 4 staff during a very turbulent time in Central African Republic's history. And then finally, I did my second rotation over at Intel and Research. And that was a three-month rotation at the end of my fellowship. And it was the first time I really felt like I was able to step back and take development, conflict resolution, human rights, justice, all of the different topics, and really flip that and look at conflicts and African politics through all of these lenses at the same time. So it was a very unique opportunity to look at the developing world, specifically sub-Saharan Africa, through a multifaceted, holistic lens. And it's been a very interesting adventure to do this type of work and to be able to interact with all of the various different executive agencies, which is, INAR is a bit unique in being a part of the Intel community, but also being a part of the policy world. So that's kind of my story. The Presidential Management Fellowship Program, I ended it and converted over to INR in August. So that's one of the biggest benefits of the program, is that once you complete it, you can just move straight over into a full-time position. Thank you.
Great. Just a question for both of you in terms of through INR, you interact with other parts of the U.S. government, the State Department. How about the United Nations? Do you interact at all with those folks?
Not normally. We'll occasionally have folks like the UN group of experts, which will come to DC, and sometimes we know these guys personally. We'll occasionally do briefings if UN wants us to do, and they'll ask us to come to New York to do a briefing. Occasionally a UN person, an SRSG, will come through and talk about their issues. But we don't have, as far as I can tell or recall, I don't think we have much direct sort of day-to-day interaction. It's sort of, we don't interact with them day-to-day. It's sort of things come up and we'll talk to them then.
I think all I would add is we do have U.S. military advisors that sometimes can be embedded in the peacekeeping operations overseas. And so oftentimes before they head out, we'll do a briefing, a country briefing on that specific region that they're going into. And then also for countries, for example, like Central African Republic, where we may have very limited amount of information coming in just because it's extremely isolated and it is a war zone. We're very reliant on what the UN reports. So I am constantly reaching out to my UN partners out in CAR to ask them what's going on in the hinterlands.
Interesting. If you have any thoughts or questions, please, now we'll turn it over to you guys. Please state who you are and where you're from when you have a question.
Hi, I'm Caroline Linford. I work here at CSIS. Sorry, I still have my coat on. I actually forgot. But this is probably for Frederick. Have you ever worked during a presidential transition, and what is it like working in a government during a presidential transition, and how does that affect the things that you're expected to do, the policies that you're expected to enact? Since you are part of the government, there is always some, unfortunately, politics involved, and what do you expect to change working in the State Department going forward?
Thanks. Frankly, in current circumstances, I don't really know how to answer that question. I can only give you examples from the past. I have worked in several administrations, Republican to Republican, Republican to Democrat, Democrat to Republican, et cetera. And I think that one of the things that we have always seen in the past is you kind of know who the people are coming in. There's a certain track record. You might have worked with them in a previous administration. They've written things. You've seen them at events like CSIS. And you kind of know who the new crew is. Sometimes you've worked with them before. And I think that what's unusual right now, at least in the Africa side of things, and I think in general in the state, we really don't know who, I personally don't know who the new crew is. So it'll be a learning experience. And ask me in a few months, and maybe I'll have a better answer for you. But we're just trying to figure out what's going on. I think the mantra that's going around, and it kind of is a mantra. It's like be professional, be professional, be professional, and that's kind of what we're trying to do now. And we'll see what happens.
Just to follow up on that, are you guys doing any briefing papers or transition teams or anything like that?
Yeah, we're working on a few. I think we actually some folks pulled together a meeting just a few weeks ago on transition papers and what various assistant secretaries of state for Africa and Africa directors at the National Security Council and national intelligence officers, what they all sort of found interesting and relevant. And I don't think it would be, spilling the beans to basically say, it's like, don't treat us like idiots. We actually know this stuff. Tell us what we don't know. Don't give us long papers. So don't treat us like children, because we actually have a pretty good background on this stuff. Don't give us tons of stuff to read because we're really, really busy. But if there's things that have come up in the last little bit of time or something that we should really know, let us know it. And so we're trying to sort of conceive of a couple of papers that might answer that question, a couple of short papers that might answer that question or those questions. I think one of the things that I've learned in this job, and in a certain sense, is that less is more. You don't want to you don't want to bury people with paper, because busy people don't have the time to deal with it. Very often, just handing them a document that says what they need to know at the time they need to know it's useful. Just a few words of a quick oral briefing and why you think that way is very useful. sometimes writing something a little more comprehensive is very worthwhile, but I find it most worthwhile for myself to sort of like get my thoughts down, get it together, and to sort of help me understand it. And sometimes other people find it very useful. Actually, I remember, this is going back a ways, but this is sort of a USAID interaction. I remember I wrote a paper not long after the Rwandan genocide, and it was just talking about how Rwanda would be acting after the genocide. This was probably August of '94, and they were sort of, you know, you had these RPF guys, they took over, and they were like, they were really proud of themselves because they had won this war. On the other hand, they were really nervous because they had just seen the genocide. The genocide just happened in their country. And I sort of wrote a paper about it. I remember a USAID guy sort of came up to me in the hall and just like had a big smile on his face, and he shook my hand and he goes, "You nailed it." And that's just, sometimes you write a paper that nails it. And but mostly it's just answering the mail, letting people know briefly, succinctly, what's going on, what they should know. Do you have anything to add on that?
The only thing I would add is one of the reasons why I truly enjoy working at INR is one of their slogans, or the slogan, is speaking truth to power. And I think this is very relevant because we, even in INR, we have dissenting papers. If there is something that we don't agree with that's going around the government, we'll actually write a paper saying, actually, INR thinks X, Y, and Z because of this evidence. And so I think that's at least my approach personally to this transition, is that our job at the end of the day is to speak truth to power, and that's what we have to continue to do.
And I will say that in the past, we've been backed up by our superiors, you know, at the assistant secretary level. And there's sort of a culture at state to sort of, you know, they might disagree with us and roll their eyes, but they read it, they pay attention to it, and they take it on board, even if they end up following a different policy.
Fellow. Joanna Chan, AAAS Fellow. Last year, I spent a year as the State Department with the International Organization Affairs Bureau. My question is, how do INR apply data, in particular open data from all the NGO, from all the different UN organizations put together in order to inform decision-making, policy-making? Thank you.
I think our attitude, we call ourselves all source analysts. So we have access to a lot of data, and we try to use all the data, and we use it in different ways. Sometimes it's sometimes it is how would you say, in the form of charts, in the form of matrices, in the form of, it's how you organize it. Sometimes it's in written form, sometimes it's in graphical form, sometimes it's in charts. I'd say it's mostly it's the facts that you bring in, and then your interpretation of the facts, just lining up the data and seeing what it says to you. I mean, that's sort of the story of analysis, is the facts are one thing, and then when you look at all the facts and you come up with something that you can get by putting various facts together that one factoid or one small group of factoids will not tell you. It actually tells you what the story might be. And so anyway, we use all sources is the quick answer. Anything yet?
Hi, Hi, I'm Heather. I'm an intern at USAID. You talked about, I'm sorry, Jennifer, you talked about being a presidential management fellow in Pathways internships. Will you talk about other hiring mechanisms at state?
So I know there's a variety of different fellowships that you can, like the Boren Fellowship, and unfortunately I'm not going to be able to speak to many of these just because I haven't really been involved in it. I can say specifically with the Presidential Management Fellowship Program that this is an outlier or a very unique set of the fellowships because I don't believe any of the other ones have the hiring authority at the end of it. So most Boren fellows, et cetera, they might have a competitive advantage, but they're not assured a job at the end of it. And as I said, another thing is these rotations, these development assignments. None of the other fellowships or internships have that opportunity to do that. So sorry, I know that probably doesn't answer your question, but I would definitely give 2 thumbs up to the PMF program. So if you're going to do one, do that one.
I just might add a little bit. I have to say, in general, our office does not generally go after PMFs. Very often, PMFs are early in their career, and they're not really sure what they want to do. And we've had some experiences where PMFs have come in, done a good job for a while, and then, left fairly suddenly to do something else. So I would say in our office there has been something of a prejudice to maybe hire somebody that's been around long enough, A, to get some experience, but more importantly, to get a sense of that this is the kind of job they really want to do. Jenny was interesting because she was just rotating through with us as a DRL PMF, Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor PMF. And she nailed the job. She was really good at it, and she really liked it. And we had a slot, so everything just sort of came together. But if she had applied to us as a PMF a couple of years before, or whenever it was that she was looking, we probably just weren't in the market. So that's just a general comment on PMFs. But that said, much of INR does love PMFs and brings them in. So if you get into INR via a PMF program and then you talk us into it, we'd be happy to have you.
Anybody else?
Good morning. I'm Jesse Dan, and I'm a business strategist. And this question is about government accountability, I guess. And how would you measure your own performance within your office, or how do you measure it?
That's a good question. That's a really good question. And that's something that I don't think I have a really clear answer to. We do try to have like metrics about how many papers you write, and we have certain minimums for that sort of thing. But as I was saying, a lot of it is not, being effective is not necessarily quantity. Very often it's quality, it's the right word to the right person at the right time that communicates a thought. And it's something that might not, much of what I do does not sort of show up on any sort of record. I think, obviously, if you write something that nails it, that tells people what they need to know when they need to know it, goes beyond the conventional wisdom, that's success. But then again, how do you measure that? It's hard to, a lot of the stuff is hard to measure. We're generally well regarded by the people that we support. mostly the State Africa Bureau, but also other bureaus, including sometimes international organizations, sometimes DRL. And I think that means something, but again, it's very hard to quantify. So I think it's just one of those, I guess the answer is you know it when you see it, but there are certain minimum metrics, but you can make all the metrics and still be a crappy analyst. Or you can make very few of the metrics or barely make the metrics and just be outstanding. So it's one of those things that we haven't quite. Social science and society is kind of hard to measure. And I think on this one, it's been difficult to measure. We have our evaluations, and you did excellent or outstanding or fully successful or whatever it is, not successful. But that's very imprecise. Yeah, and you might have a sort of written essay to sort of explain how the person does. And it's like, okay, it might be a nice essay, it might say what they do, but it's not hard data. So I guess the answer is it's a disappointing answer.
I would just add from having been in different bureaus in the State Department and AID, but interact with Rick and other folks at INR, it's in a sense, it's a relatively small world when you're working on Africa. And if you've been around for a few years, you get to know the folks in INR, whether you're an aide or I was in the Africa Bureau at State and PRM, and then various places in AID. And it comes in, you learn very quickly who the experts are in the area you're working. And you go to these guys when there's special issues or you have meetings, the G7, the G20 come up. These are the folks you go to for just a background briefing or to understand what's going on in a more in-depth way than you get with a few cables you read on it during the course of a week or so. So it's kind of nice to have a resource there that you can go to and get very sound and in-depth explanations of what's going on in a given country or what's happening with the presidential election in the Congo and talk about the various candidates who may or may not actually get a chance to run against Kabila in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And so INR plays a very important role to the rest of the U.S. government in the foreign affairs area, and particularly aid and state, where you can go to get really sound analysis. And it's interesting, I think INR is the only part of the State Department that really can offer a dissenting opinion of a very strong-willed ambassador who has a very focused way of wanting to deal with the country. INR is the part that can disagree with the approach that ambassador's taking and lay it out and for people to see. Because just the nature of the State Department and an embassy, you don't disagree with your ambassador very often.
And I work for him.
Yeah, that's right. And so INR plays a very important role as well as offering alternative opinions to what may be the standard practice in an embassy. So they play a very unique role. It's kind of an important place.
Just quick to follow up on that. We do not do the policy. We could sort of call ourselves, we're policy relevant, but we're not policy prescriptive. And so we stay away from the policy per se, but we want to give people information analysis that will support the policy. It is interesting, in other parts of the intelligence community, there has been this effort for the last several years, to do opportunity analysis, which is basically to give policy suggestions. And we in INR think that's really stupid. Stupid for two reasons. One is a lot of the policymakers are pretty smart people who've been thinking about this stuff. And so I would say that, when I'm on my game, maybe once every year or two, I'll come up with something that's a really good idea that somebody hasn't thought of yet. Once every year or two at best. And I think that's better than most. But the other thing is when you start writing for policymakers, when you start putting down, this is what I think our policy should be, I think intellectually you kind of corrupt yourself because you start rooting for the outcome that you want based on your policy suggestion. And I think that to do our jobs well, we should sort of be rooting for nothing. We should be rooting for the right answer, so that even if even if it is doom and gloom, it's like, well, I nailed that one. I got that one right. So the world's gone to hell, but it's like, I called it. You can die with a smile on your face, I suppose. I'll stop now.
Hi, I'm Jess Epstein. I'm a SSS fellow at USAID and also a social scientist. So I find myself wondering about the kinds of data you're drawing on in the analyses you're doing, and I was hoping you could speak to the kinds of intelligence that are the inputs for your work.
I'm sorry, that's classified. No, what we do is, Jenny can add on, what we do is we just try to get information wherever we can. We talk to people. We read the cables that Bill writes from DRC or wherever. We read the intelligence from all sources, from all the agencies. We read the press. We read articles. We read blogs. We read Twitter links. We read, we talk to people. We talk to people who are on the scenes. As I say, we also get out there from time to time. I worked for Bill for a couple of times, a couple of different times, about 6 weeks apiece, when he was ambassador out in DRC. Jenny spent 4 months in the Central African Republic, and so we next week the African Studies Association is going to be in town, and we plan to spend a good chunk of time sort of hitting some of the sessions and chatting to old friends and meeting new people and trying to figure out what they know. So it's just some people are more systematic about it. People do it differently. We have some people that they sit at their desk and they read everything, absolutely everything, but they don't talk to people and they don't like to do as many TDYs overseas. You have other people that like to do a lot of TDYs and might not be as focused on the reading. You have some people that do it all. It's just, there's a little bit of room in our office for different ways of sort of doing the job, but as long as you have good, as long as you're knowledgeable, as long as you're insightful, as long as you can contribute, that's what we look for. I hope that answers the question.
Hi, my name is Pia Nunez. I am I'm a student of a joint program between Georgetown Law and the Graduate Institute of Geneva. I think my question would be more for Jennifer. You've already talked about this, but for someone interested in working on international development, how do you start looking for something, and how do you filter between the so many different options between international organizations, NGOs, state like governments, especially for me that I'm clearly not from the US?
That's a good question. I think that it's obviously something personally you're going to have to kind of figure out where you want to be. The advantages of being at maybe a non-governmental organization is that you're that outside accountability mechanism for the government, which is one of the reasons why I didn't want to work within the government. Is I always view myself as an advocate, and I wasn't sure what that looked like when you were actually a U.S. government employee. But then as I went over to Department of State, I found several bureaus where I could still be an advocate in sense, even internally. At Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, we represent very, I don't want to say narrow equities, but very specific equities, making sure that our foreign policy has human rights at the core of it, and good governance principles, which is not always what we view as our traditional national interest, but we represented the values of our country. So that was a wonderful place to work, and I felt like I was able to continue to use my background in international development, security, human rights. Those principles were integrated into that position. And as I said before, with INR, I was able to bring my knowledge and background into my analysis. So, I mean, when navigating the waters of whether or not you go to an NGO or you go to a think tank or you become an academic or whatever else, I think for me it's just being able to identify what are those core values and principles and what type of angle do you want to come at it from. I mean, in addition to answering some, also going back to another question on what sources we use, think tanks. I meet with individuals that work at think tanks, and they come at these issues from a very different perspective. So each one of them, NGOs, think tanks, academics, all of these individuals we use in our analysis in INR. So they all have value. So that's my advice, is probably to try a few things. I worked in the NGO world as a consultant as well as a full-time employee. I loved it. I would do it again. And as I said, I never thought I'd be working for the U.S. government. But it has been, yes, another plug I would say is working for the U.S. No matter what position you have, you are likely going to be interacting with the U.S. government. They are going to be an audience. They are going to be an entity you're pushing. In some way, you're going to interact with them. So being able to be on the inside and understanding how policymakers think, what words are triggers, how to kind of, I don't want to say pull the strings, but how to be able to communicate to them in an effective way. I cannot say that I had that knowledge before working for the U.S. government. So I highly recommend, if you've got the chance, do an internship, try to get some experience with U.S. government or another government, just to be able to understand the complexity, the opaqueness, the way in which to kind of awake the hierarchy is what I would say, because these policymakers, as Rick mentioned, they're very, very busy. And so I know the Enough Project just made this 2-page document on how sanctions can be effective overseas. And I sent them an email and said, thank you for making it 2 pages. Like, people are actually going to read this versus a 50-page document that we might get through the executive summary. It's just, there's very limited time. So I think that getting that perspective is very, very helpful.
And just to add, I think as well, you have the U.S. government, you have the private sector, you have the United Nations, you have NGOs. If you're around the business, people move back and forth among these various options all the time. I work for an NGO. I retired from the government. I've worked in state and aid. I was here at CSIS for a number of years. So people move around, and I think, which is very good. It's cross-fertilization, and you get to engage at all from different perspectives, with different people. So it's really good to work in all different sorts of the elements of foreign affairs.
I would just add on to that, and I think you mentioned something like that a little earlier, and that is, the longer you're in this field, the more you get to know the other people in the field, and the more they get to know you. And if you do a good job, they get to know you and like you and respect you. And so if you're in the field for a while, you kind of establish yourself. Just
Hi, my name is Hannah. I'm with the Genocide Prevention Center at George Mason. My question is for you, Jennifer, specifically from your experience working in CAR. Do you think there's an action or actions that the U.S. government could have taken in relation to conflict prevention rather than conflict response that would have made a difference at the time?
That's a really good question. And last week, I think I went to a workshop on atrocity prevention, specifically looking at it in the broad context and whether or not we're actually going to have an atrocity prevention board in the next 4 years or so. But then also flipping it specifically on the CAR context. I mean, what I'll say is, you know, being in CAR, I actually grew up on a very small island in Africa called Comoros and went through 6 attempted coups, a 7th successful one, and thought that this was one of the most complicated little countries in the world, and decided to go out to CAR because I thought that it would be even more interesting. When I got on the ground, I realized that it's an extremely complicated conflict, maybe the most complex that I've ever seen. And coming back to my conflict analysis and resolution, I mapped out all of the different conflict dynamics and realized it was one that, you know, you almost like a web, you pull one string trying to solve the problem, and it affects the rest of this web of relationships with the conflict dynamics, and it usually exacerbates or even destroys another sector. So, in a roundabout way, sorry. I think that our policy in CAR has been very effective. And I think that one of the hard things about conflict prevention, atrocity prevention, is it's very, very difficult to measure. You're measuring something that hasn't happened. And I mean, I think that CAR getting through an election, which I can say, to be very honest, was a very difficult thing to do, and being on the ground at the embassy during September 2015, when things started to kind of unravel and we started seeing what we saw back in 2012, these ex-Elika, these armed groups moving to Bangui to take it over, we reacted very differently in that circumstance than we did a few years ago. So we are learning lessons and we are addressing things different, and I think that, you know, maybe our policy back in 2011, 2012, I know a lot of people have argued that we were too late. We maybe started implementing better policies, looking at more long-term solution rather than just that reactive nature. And we may have made some, I don't want to say mistakes, we made calls that didn't necessarily have the outcomes we wanted. But we have learned a lot from it. And now that our embassy is reopened there, we didn't close up shop in September 2015. We considered it. And the EU pulled out and other missions did, but the US stayed. And some of that was learning lessons from the years in the past. So I think that with CAR, we continue to look. If you all were looking at the donors conference that just happened last week, we are providing the largest amount of money. So I think we are learning. We are learning that Central African Republic, though there's not great U.S. interest there, natural U.S. interest there, this atrocity prevention angle, conflict prevention, understanding the regional impact of a country like CAR being consistently in crisis is something that the U.S. government should be paying attention to and putting a lot of interest and policy and good decision-making into it.
Let me just follow up on that. It's sort of the idea of unintended consequences had nothing to do with the Central African Republic, but as Jenny was talking, I was thinking of the case of Libya a few years ago. We wanted to prevent a genocide in Libya. There were reports that Gaddafi was going to be moving on Benghazi in force, threatening to kill every man, woman, and child in the area. And that was the logic for our intervention, our Western intervention that was blessed by the UN. And so we know that our intervention in Libya hasn't gone so well. It has basically created a tremendously unstable state. Gaddafi's gone, but he's been replaced by a fairly chaotic situation. so we know what happened because of our intervention. What we don't know is what didn't happen because of our intervention. You know, would Gaddafi have just stabilized the place and then gone on ruling more or less like he would have? Would he have gone and wiped out everybody in Benghazi and had, you know, a genocide on our hands? So it is one of those things that it's very difficult to sort of, you know when you've succeeded. You know when you failed in retrospect, but sometimes your success is based on what didn't happen.
A little bit about what kind of tools or methodology or theory you use to analyze that kind of relationships.
Well, I'm a conflict resolution kind of guy. So I think in terms of conflict resolution, I think in terms of history. And what I mean by history is the idea of history as opposed to political science is in history you basically gather all the data you can, stare at the data, and then try to make sense of the data you have. In political science, you look at the various models that are out there and then apply the models to the data. And so I would say I kind of do both. I think my prejudice is history, so what I tend to do is try to look at all the angles. But then I studied a fair amount of political science and comparative and conflict resolution. And so I tend to sort of bring some of those models in as appropriate. But it's nothing fixed for me. I suppose if I have a mental image of how I operate, as I basically think of little vectors in my head, little arrows put, with direction and force, pushing different directions. And I look at all the data and I sort of see how they might make the various arrows, what directions and how strong the arrows are. And this is all going on in my head, and then and then you just sort of add up the arrows and sort of see what general direction you might be coming up with. That's kind of a rough, it's very hard to sort of explain how you think, but that's, and I think other people do it differently. But there's no sort of rigid, thou shalt think like this. But that's kind of a rough idea of how I tend to look at a lot of things.
Hi, Patricia Flanagan, USAID Africa Bureau. Rick, my question to you is, since you're looking from the historical perspective and your studies, as well as being in State Department for a long time, how do you see the role of technology, ICT, communications, changing that in terms of both, from our side, data analytics, being able to actually get more real-time data, as well as data and technology for both the governments and the stakeholders in country, as well as maybe some nefarious groups? How do you see that working for and against us in terms of your modeling and your negotiations and your policies?
Well, it means the data comes quicker. I think there actually is an issue of you don't want to be distracted by factoids. You have a lot of factoids coming in, and you can be overwhelmed by that. It's like, constantly answering your email or constantly looking at your telephone. Sometimes it makes sense to sort of sit back and digest the data you have. Digest the data, work on that. And rather than constantly being, concentrating on the new data. Sometimes the new data is important. And what I mean by new data, I mean, it's okay to check it once a day if it's as opposed to every 5 minutes. I think that sometimes if you focus too much on the data, you're distracted. Does that answer? What's the question?
Yes, as well as on the other side, working with country governments and country stakeholders in the past, not having availability of data, not having availability of sort of a window into global perspectives or other information. Now we see Africa being only continent sub-Saharan Africa, about less than 10% have connectivity, but it is growing. And so how do you see that changing in terms of helping or hindering what we're trying to do?
Well, I think one of the things is something that used to be called the CNN effect. Is, if a tree falls in the woods and nobody hears it, doesn't make a sound. And I think that in the past, there were a lot of trees that were falling in the woods that nobody was seeing. Central African Republic's a very good example. I don't know the Central African Republic very well at all. I've never been there. But I was following the LRA. And some years ago, the LRA wandered into the Central African Republic. And I sort of was looking at it there, and I had no idea that the LRA was the least of the Central African Republic's problems. That was really a mess. There were all kinds of groups, and the LRA was the least of them. So I think that the data makes the technology makes things apparent to us now that weren't apparent before. The CNN effect, what used to be called the CNN effect, means that we sort of feel an urge to do something about it. I think that since the CNN effect has come in, sometimes we've gotten a little tired of it. Populations and governments, it's like, and sort of have a sense of our limitations of being able to actually do something positive. So there's a sort of exhaustion. So it's a thing that comes back and goes back and forth. I hope that answers the question. Do you have anything to?
Yeah, I mean, I think the only thing I would add is that we've got tons and tons of information at this point. And I think one of the struggles for me personally in this job is I'm not the only one that has access to all this information, and maybe at some point the Intel community was the one that you could maybe even say has the most access to information. Now we can get a policymaker, someone, a regular citizen at a computer can get access to various types of social media data. The one that comes to mind is ACLED. I don't know if anyone here is familiar with it, but it's an online database of Sub-Saharan Africa and I think Asia, all of the different open source, press, NGO, et cetera, reports of conflict throughout the country. And this is used a lot by policymakers who will come to me and say, we're looking at all this violence in this area, there's tons of civilian casualties. And for me, my job is to help them understand what they're looking at and potentially some of the biases that are there or how there might be errors and flaws. NGOs have been using satellite imagery a lot in their reporting, and sometimes it's not done accurately, or maybe it's a little bit more of an opaque nature than what they're able to bring to the analysis. And so a lot of what I think we do is take this technology that's being used now, that's accessible all over to the average day citizen, and being able to make it informative and kind of draw out the opaqueness nature that it can have.
Being mindful of everyone's time, we've come up on the hour. Is there a final question someone would like to ask? And then, okay.
Hi, Jordan Reyes, Hoover Institution. You said you use history to help frame your thinking and looking at current situations or problems. Could you, this might actually be a personal question, but could you maybe give us a few of your historical figures and whose views of the world that you use to look at the current problems?
Well, what I mean by history, actually, I'll try to get at that question, but what I mean by history is gathering data and looking at the data and then making your judgments, decisions based on all this data that you have without necessarily looking at models first. Look at the data and then come up with your model. Make up a model based on to fit the situation. So that's what I mean by the history part. And then sort of historical figures that would be influential in my thinking, or?
Perhaps like worldviews. I know when we look at history, we often tie ourselves or gravitate towards certain thinkers and strategists. I was curious if you have a few that you use to run your kind of current knowledge.
Well, like Zartman right down the street here, Bill Zartman on a lot of his conflict resolution thinking. I think I don't know. I'm not necessarily inspired by historical figures, if that's the right word. I mean, I sort of, there are certain presidents or world leaders of one sort or another that I like or respect, or, well, they might be flawed in this way, but they did this good thing. So I don't really, I haven't really been intellectually inspired, I don't think, by a world leader, by a historical figure. Do you have anything to?
Other than Woody Allen,
Maybe not him.
Well, please join me in thanking Rick and Jennifer for being here today. Thank you.